palette set up, and the history palette is going to be key to creating this kind of painting. Y'all know in Photoshop you don't have infinite undos, but you do have the history palette, right? So if you need to back up whatever I do on here, let's see if I can grab my brush tool and make it really, really big. It records every time I make a change to whatever I do. So if I need to go back in history, I can step backwards, and this is what it's doing whenever I'm stepping backwards or forward in this way. I can even go all the way back to the beginning. Another thing that it's doing is I can create what are called snapshots of my work. And so as I'm working, if I reach a point where, hey, I'd really like to save what I'm doing, let's say I did a whole bunch of paintings and stuff on top of this, and I said, hey, this is great. I want to save this so I can go back to it in case something happens. At the very bottom of your history palette is this icon. It's a snapshot icon. When I create it, we'll say OK. It creates a little snapshot up here at the top. Essentially, it saves a snapshot in time of what was done. So if I was to undo, I can click on my snapshot, and it puts everything back to normal. I can even go back to my beginning, or I can jump ahead and go to this snapshot, and I haven't lost anything. So it's kind of a super way of saving something. It does add on to a lot of memory to your file, but it's a way of, if you've got a lot going on and you want to be able to undo it, especially if you know you're doing a lot of painting, making a snapshot is one way of working with it. I'm going to get rid of this. So here's another thing that the history brush does. First off, the brush I'm going to be using today is the art history brush, but let me tell you about the history brush. With the history brush, it will look at whatever snapshot you have and will undo or go back in history to that point in time. So I'm going to grab my regular brush, and let's say I painted over all of this. I'll grab my just regular history brush for now. And it works just like a regular brush, so you can change up the styles or things. I'll just keep it a simple brush for now. Whatever my, what is this called? The source icon is on. This is my source icon. Whatever that is on, it will, repaint back to that source. So I can actually go back and paint or undo back to that point. Pretty cool? It's actually looking at that source and repainting to it. So even if, let's say I made a snapshot of this point in history. There's that, say OK. I can choose this as a source, go in, maybe paint some black on or white on top of that. Now when I grab my history brush, what snapshot have I got? It's the one with all the yellow on top of it. I can go back and actually add back in the yellow bits that were there. Or I can go back farther and add the beginning bits and get rid of all those. Pretty cool? So the main thing is I'm using the snapshots to tell what point in history I want to be able to paint. That's the second key to doing this. Here's the caveat to it. It doesn't remember everything. It's not perfect for everything that we're doing. Watch what happens if I was to add another layer to my background. Right now I've just been working on one layer. If I add another layer to here and I go to paint, well, hang on a second. Did Photoshop fix this? Is this something new? Usually it'll give you an error saying that, hey, that layer was not part of your history, although it seems to be picking up on something now. Huh, okay. Never mind then. Forget what I was just telling you. This is something new. In older versions, maybe this is a new update, it would recognize that, hey, there wasn't a new layer on this older snapshot that you created, so you can't paint back on top of that. Looks like I just made a new layer and looks like I'm able to paint back on top of it. Actually, you can see within that layer, that's what's being painted on top of that. That's good to know. So I can actually go in and repaint on top of that. So forget what I was about to tell you. You can actually create new layers and do new things. The main thing is if you erase away something or if you change up something too much, Photoshop may not be able to look back in history and paint over what you just created. Does that make sense? Okay. We're going to keep it very, very simple for this particular exercise. I'll get rid of what I'm doing. What I want to do is I want to create a painting that has an underpainting, an underlayer, and then I want to have a details painting on top of that. Have you ever taken Mr. Smathers' painting and you have to do usually a landscape or something? What does he tell you to do for your background? A different color. Usually what kind of color? A warm color? Yeah, it's either a warm color or a cool color. Like if you're painting something very cool on top of it, you'll have a warm underlayer. Or sometimes you'll have the complementary of whatever your color is. So if you're painting something that's got a bright blue sky, your underpainting will have orange or red underneath it to complement it out. We want to do the same thing for this kind of painting. We want it to look very, very painterly. Before I even get into that, let me show you this last thing. So that was the history brush. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Here's the art history brush. The art history brush works the same way, but it was made to make your brush strokes look more artistic. It was made to add some randomness to your brush strokes. So with this one, you can kind of get an idea of what the icon looks like. It's got the little swirl to it. You can have a brush, and we'll set my settings back up, and you can choose a style for how you want the randomness to go. And so there's tight and short, there's loose, there's curls, there's even a dab. Right now I'm just going to keep it loose and long. Actually, let's do one of these long, tight and long. Now when I click, it's going to be looking at my primary snapshot that I have selected and adding random brush strokes to it. And it creates little things that look like this. So now, very quickly, very easily, it picks up on those colors and it makes it look painterly. Pretty cool. So just in a couple of clicks, I can take a photograph that looks like this and turn it into something that's got more of a painterly, quick kind of style, depending on the style that you did. So that was tight and long. Let's do loose and long. Loose and long creates something that looks a little bit more impressionistic. When I see amateurs use this, I can tell exactly what they're doing. You know, they found this brush or this technique and it looks like they've got spaghetti all over it. If you change the size of your brush, of course you can get better details. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller. And when I go over it, it looks like this. So I can pick up on smaller details. Again, it's giving me that painterly look and feel. That may be something that you're going for. If I make it larger, of course, I will lose details. And then I can go back down to small. Remember, I haven't lost my image. It's still looking at my history, and so I can go back on top of it and pull the image back out of it. Pretty neat. Like I said, this is something that you just play around with. Let's try even a different brush. Instead of a round brush, if I got one of my fancy, let's do a feather brush. One that looks like this. So it'll do brush strokes that look like that. For better or worse, that may not be what you're going for. You play around with it. You can open up your brush presets. Remember we played around with this with the first one. You can change your spacing, your brush dynamics, maybe change up the size of it and the angle of them. And so now when I do brush, it'll look something like this. And it does a pretty good job of going in the direction and that your colors are grouped in. And so you can see the same colors are starting to paint around that particular area. But very, very quickly you can create a large mess. Here's what we're going to do for this one. Let's go back to my original painting. I've got this. I'm going to change up the colors for this particular painting. And I'm going to do so with my adjustments layer. One of the adjustments is your hue and saturation. Remember when you create it, it creates its own little layer and it opens up the properties. With this one, if I change up my hue, move the slider around, it shifts all the colors to a different spectrum. And so if I wanted to get a vastly different color for all of these, I can easily shift it off to one side. So instead of having orange and yellow, I've got more greenish blue kind of flowers. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something that's different. Again, this will be my underpainting. I'm going to flatten this so that I'm working with just one layer. And to flatten, you can go to Image, flatten the image. So now I've just got one. And I'm going to create a new snapshot up here. And you can call it underpainting as well. So check out what I got. This one and this one. The next thing I'm going to do, rather than looking at my image, I'm going to prime it with just a solid color. To quickly fill in your background with a solid color, you can do Shift and Delete. It'll give you some options. You can choose, I like to use 50% gray simply because it's pretty cool, or you can use a solid color or a pattern. Let's do a solid color. And let's say I wanted my background to have, kind of this muted green, something neutral. That looks good. All right, so I've lost my image. I've replaced it with the green background. I'm going to go back to my normal paintbrush that I'm working with. Now let's play around. In my history palette, I want to do my underpainting first. So we need to select that icon. That's where I'm pulling my information from. The other things to play around with, besides your style, are the opacity and the amount of area that you're working with. I keep my tolerance down to 0. I've found very little use for changing this up. Also, I'm working in normal drawing mode. I'll show you the differences between those. But the opacity will allow me to overlay my colors a lot better. The area tells me how much area that I'm covering. So if I was to start painting now, I'll make mine fairly big, it would look something like this. That's 100% opacity. If I drop my opacity down to something drastic, closer to say 10%, and start painting, I get something that looks like this. This looks a lot more like a painting. When you do a painting, especially watercolors, they blend together. And this is kind of the style that you'll want to go for your underpainting. Again, I can change my size of my brush and I get a little bit more details. The other thing I can do is to change my area. The area is the radius of pixels that your brush is going to move out. So right now it's roughly 166. If I drop this down to something under 100, here's a smaller area. Let's do something way large. Say it usually goes up to 500. 500 covers a much, much larger area. Does that kind of make sense? Playing around with the area just kind of plays around with the amount that it's going to be changing up. So I usually fluctuate my area as necessary. Also, fluctuate what style you want. Ooh, here's curls. Curls tends to give you some interesting results. Okay, but that'll be my underpainting. To do the details, now I want to swap over to a smaller brush, and in my history palette, I want to choose this one. Be careful, if you accidentally hit this, it's going to revert back to that previous state. If that happens, no worries. Just go to the bottom of your history palette, click there, and it will load back up everything you did. But we're working on our original state. Get me a small brush, teeny tiny. When I say small, it's like 3 pixels large. Then I can go back in and start painting in the details for my flowers. This looks a lot more painterly because it's picking up some of my underpainting. I'm not just keeping my original colors. It's giving me a little bit of happy accidents, a little bit of randomness that you would normally find within an artwork. And this is what a lot of amateurs, when they first find the painting, they forget about. They think, oh, just because it's making random brush strokes, then it will create really good random artwork. Not necessarily true. Making a painting is just as much about the color that you use and the choices that you use for your composition. You also have to play around with composition. Yes, you have to know about design.
Are you still on the opacity thing?
Yes, my opacity is still very, very low. Good point. If I brought my opacity back up to 100%, here's what it would start looking like. So there's that, which you can totally do. I mean, you know, that's a style. If I changed up even the style of my brush to let's do loose long curls, make it look like that. I prefer to keep my opacity low, simply so it will overlay, and it takes a little time to build up. You can see I'm actually having to work over an area a longer time, but it will eventually reveal the petals that I want. I want to see some of my underlayer. When my opacity was at 100%, it immediately obliterates my underpainting. And so you get that kind of style as well. Let's do those apples down at the bottom. Click, drag over it. There are some different blending modes that you can work in as well. By default, I like to keep it in normal, but if you want to darken in or multiply the colors together or screen the colors, let's say if I worked in darken, this will pick up some of the darker colors. Of course, it's kind of a low-key painting to begin with. Let's see if the lighten will actually work. Not too much. It'll actually pick up some of the lighter colors that are on here. Sometimes they work better than others. There we go. Give it a little bit of a glow. All I did was make my brush a little bit bigger, and now you can see it's affecting it much, much more. Vary the size of your brush, vary the style of your brush. Maybe up at the top, rather than using a rounded brush, I can use, let's go back to my feathered brush that I had. Y'all go away, I'm having fun. Oh, nope, not lighten. Let's go back to normal. Let's see what we're doing. Give myself just a little bit of a different technique, different feel to how it looks. This shouldn't take you a lot of time to do. You can see I'm spending more time explaining how it's done than actually doing it itself. But you got plenty of time to play around to see what this would look like. So I've gone from a photograph of a composition or a composition that I worked with to a more artistic painting of a composition that I have. What I want you guys to do, choose two. I want you to do 2 still life paintings. Again, you can create your own or you can use one of these and use this technique. The instructions that I gave you were very, very simple on how to set it up. Your job is to kind of play around with the opacity, the styles, even the area that it covers, and see what it works with. The first time you go through, do an underpainting. The second time, do the details on top of it. I guarantee you'll get some great results with that. Try it with a portrait as well, like your own portrait. That tends to work. Ooh, one last thing I'll show you. When using this technique, it works best if you have medium to low resolution image. Right now my resolution is at 300 dpi, plenty of resolution for printing. But if you take somebody's portrait, especially if you're working in Camera Raw and it's got like a resolution of 600, you're going to get different results because you got so many pixels to deal with. It's going to take you forever to do the painting. So working with 300 or less resolution tends to give you a lot better painterly results for that. Unless Photoshop's fixed that, and like it has for the art history brush, and you don't know about it. All right. That's our last exercise for this unit. Once you've finished up, or even if you've finished up, I want you to try this one, and maybe you can try that for one of your